The valley held its breath in early autumn, the way only high country can, air thin and sharp, sky so wide it pressed down on the shoulders like a second weight alongside the work. The mountains at the northern rim had already taken their first dusting of snow, white caps floating above the timberline like something borrowed from a different season, a warning sent early. Down on the valley floor, the grasses had gone the color of dried honey, and the creek, Sallow Creek, locals called it, on account of the pale clay that clouded its shallows after rain, ran cold enough now that a man's hand ached within seconds of breaking its surface. The homestead sat near the creek's eastern bend, modest against the scale of everything around it. A cabin of notched pine logs, a root cellar dug into the slope behind it, a barn that leaned just slightly southward, as though resting after effort. A kitchen garden going ragged at the edges, the last of the squash vines brown and papery on their mounds. A fence line that ran straight and true on the west side, then curved impractically where it met a jutting shelf of limestone neither of them had wanted to blast. And behind the cabin, separated from it by a stretch of open ground where the soil ran deep and black and generous, the orchard. 40 trees, give or take, not planted by their hands. The man who had worked this claim before them had possessed more ambition than endurance, and he had planted the trees his first spring and abandoned the claim by his second autumn, leaving behind a half-dug well, a debt he could not name, and 40 apple saplings in careful rows, as though they were a question he never stayed to answer. That had been 4 years past. The trees had grown on without him, stubbornly rooted in the high valley soil. And now, in this September of 1879, they stood heavy with fruit, red and gold apples crowding every branch, bowing the smaller limbs toward the earth, filling the air with a smell so ripe and sweet it seemed almost reckless, a kind of abundance the land had not asked permission to produce. This was the stake, the land placed on the table before the people even spoke. A frost-prone valley, a cold creek, a mountain sky that gave no guarantees, and in the middle of it, 40 trees producing more fruit than a single season's selling could carry away, more than any root cellar could safely hold through a Wyoming winter, more than anyone in the valley had quite planned for. The light that afternoon came in low and gold across the orchard, turning each apple into something that glowed from within. The leaves had begun to turn at their edges, rust and amber creeping inward from the tips, and the whole orchard seemed to hum with a quiet urgency, as though it too understood that the cold was coming and that something had to be decided soon. Emmett moved through the orchard with a picking crate braced against his hip, working row by row the way he always did, methodically, unhurried, the way a man works when he trusts the task more than the clock. The apples came off the branches with a clean, decisive snap, and he set each one into the crate with care, not dropping them, never dropping them, because a bruised apple was a dying apple, and he had learned that much in 2 seasons on this land. She walked behind him at her own pace, slower, stopping more often. She would hold an apple up to the low afternoon light and turn it slowly, studying the skin the way another person might read a letter, looking for something the surface carried but did not announce. The color this year was deeper than last, a red that went almost to burgundy on the south-facing side, with a yellow-green shoulder where the branch had shaded it. She had never seen them this full, this sound, not a blemished one in the first 3 rows, not a soft spot, not a split. He paused at the end of a row and watched her for a moment. There was a particular quality to her stillness when her mind was working that he had come to recognize. A quiet that was not restful, but concentrated, the way water looks before it moves. He asked her what she was thinking. She said she was thinking about all of it, about the 40 trees and the weight of what they'd given, and what the valley would pay for a bushel come Saturday market, and what a root cellar could actually hold through a Wyoming winter, and whether holding was the same thing as keeping. She turned the apple once more and then lowered it and looked at him directly, the way she did when she had already decided something and was only now deciding how to say it. She told him she did not want to sell them all. Not most of them. Maybe not even half. He waited. She said she wanted to bury them. The words sat in the orchard air between them for a moment, neither heavy nor light, just present, asking to be considered. He looked at the crate in his hands, then at the rows still unharvested, the gold and red crowding the branches in every direction, the yield of 40 trees in their best year, and he felt the thing a practical man feels when someone he trusts says something he has not yet caught up to. He did not laugh, but he did not immediately understand, either. He asked her what she meant by bury. She told him she would explain it properly that evening, when the light was gone, and the crates were counted, and they were sitting still enough to think. She said her grandmother had written of it, that it was old knowledge, and that she believed it could work here, if they were careful, and started soon. The cold was already in the evening air, pressing down from the ridge. The lamp was burning low by the time the crates were counted and stacked along the cabin wall. Outside, the creek made its steady sound in the dark, and the ridge had gone black against a sky salted with stars. They sat at the table together, and she brought out the letter. It was old paper, the kind that had been folded and refolded until the creases were soft as cloth. Her grandmother had written it in Slovak, mostly, but had switched to a slow English partway through, as though she had wanted her granddaughter to be able to read certain parts herself, without translation. She smoothed it flat on the table between them and found the passage she meant, running her finger just beneath the lines as she read aloud. The old village, her grandmother had written, kept its autumn fruit not in a cool room, but in the cool earth itself. The women of the village would throw their own pots, wide-mouthed, thick-walled, and dry them hard. Each apple was wrapped individually in dry straw before it was placed inside, the straw pulling away any small moisture that might turn to rot. When a pot was full, the lid was pressed on tight, the seams sealed with a mixture of clay and beeswax worked together while warm, and then the whole thing was carried out behind the root house and set down into a trench, dug a full 2 feet into the ground, covered over, packed in, left to the earth's patience. The cold above ground could do what it liked. 2 feet down, the temperature held. He listened without interrupting. When she finished reading, he sat quiet for a moment, one hand flat on the table. Then he asked how many pots they would need. She had already worked it out. 18, roughly, if each held somewhere between 20 and 30 apples. He asked whether she knew how to throw a pot that size. She said she did not with certainty, but that she knew where to find clay along the lower bank of the creek, and that the forms did not need to be beautiful. They needed to be sound. He asked about the beeswax. She reminded him of the half-block they had kept from last spring's purchase at the mill. He nodded, thinking through it. He asked whether she believed it would hold against the kind of cold this valley could bring. She looked at him steadily across the lamp. She said she believed her grandmother would not have written it down with such care if it had ever failed her people. That was what settled it. He did not say much more that night, but she could see the thing shifting in him, the way a practical man moves from not yet understanding to beginning to plan. He banked the fire and went to bed. She stayed a few minutes longer with the letter, refolding it along its old careful lines. Before first light, she heard him outside, the sound of a shovel meeting earth. The clay along the lower bank of Sallow Creek was gray and heavy, threaded through with fine silt, and it pulled at the boot with each step down to the water line. He had been there before for other purposes, mending the chimney base, filling low spots in the cellar floor, but never with this kind of need. He cut it out in blocks with a flat spade and loaded it into the barrow, and she came behind him and examined each block with her hands, pressing her thumb into it, feeling for grit or loose sand, discarding what would not hold. It was slow and cold, and the creek smell rose around them like a living thing. They built the forms over 2 days, working the clay on the wide, flat stone behind the cabin, shaping it up in coils the way she had read it described, not thrown on a wheel, which neither of them had, but built by hand, each ring of clay pressed and smoothed against the one below until the walls rose thick and even. The forms were not elegant. They were wide-mouthed vessels, heavy-shouldered, with sides an inch thick and a fitted lid that would be sealed at the last. She smoothed the seams. He kept the fire fed so the finished ones could dry near its warmth, without cracking. When the first pot emerged from the heat intact, she ran her knuckle along its lip and did not say anything, but he saw the small relief that passed through her. The apples had to be wrapped. They spread dry straw across the table and worked together in the evenings. Each apple turned slowly in her hands, checked for soft spots, for bruise or puncture, then settled into its nest of straw and placed gently into the waiting pot. The smell of it filled the cabin, sweet and green, and faintly fermented at the edges, the smell of a harvest not yet gone. 20 to a pot, sometimes more, packed close but not crowded. She counted as they went. He kept the tally on the back of a shingle with a nail. When each pot was filled, he melted the beeswax at the edge of the fire, and she mixed it with softened clay into a sealing paste, pressing it around the fitted lid until no gap remained. Then he carried each sealed pot out to the trench they had dug behind the root cellar, 2 feet deep, the walls tamped firm, and set it down level into the cold earth. She shoveled the fill back over it herself. By the 4th day, the rows were finished. 18 pots. The yard behind the root cellar looked like something between a garden and a burial. Low ridges of dark-turned earth running parallel in the afternoon light, muddy and raw and without ceremony. The cold was already coming down from the northern hills, threading itself into the evenings. The valley smelled of frost and iron. She stood at the end of the last row and looked at what they had made. She stood there long enough that the shadows from the ridge crept across the yard and swallowed the last row whole. The turned earth looked dark and foreign against the pale autumn grass, and she understood, standing there, how it must appear to anyone passing on the road. She did not have to wait long to find out. 2 days after the last pot was buried, the Granger wagon came down the valley road at a slow roll, the way it always did when someone aboard was taking their time, looking at something they intended to have an opinion about. There were 3 of them on the bench: Holt Granger, his older brother Wade, and a hired hand whose name she had never learned. They slowed to nearly a stop at the fence line. Holt Granger leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the low ridges behind the root cellar for a long moment. Then he said something to his brother that made them both laugh, and the hired hand laughed too, though he couldn't have known why, and the wagon rolled on. It was not the last of it. Widow Foss came the following afternoon with a jar of preserves she meant as a neighborly gift, and when she saw the muddy rows, she stood very still at the gate and said what a pity it was, burying good-eating apples in the ground like they were something to be ashamed of. She said she hoped they had kept enough back for themselves. She said her own root cellar was packed tight with dried apple rings, and that a person didn't need anything fancier than that. She said it gently, the way people say things they believe to be both true and kind, and it was worse for that. By the end of the week, the word had circled through enough households that the couple heard it back from 2 directions. Strange old practice, foreign notion, waste of a decent harvest. Some people said it with a shake of the head. Others seemed almost satisfied, as though the mud rows confirmed something they had already suspected about the pair. He didn't say much about any of it until the evening. The wind shifted, and the first hard cold came sweeping down from the north, carrying the smell of early ice. They were sitting at the table after supper, and the fire had settled to coals, and he said it quietly, without looking up from his hands. He said he wondered, sometimes, in the middle of the night, if they had made a mistake. The room held that for a moment. She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. She told him what her grandmother had written in the letter. Not the instructions, but the line before the instructions. The old woman had written that the earth keeps faith better than any cellar built by human hands. She told him to wait, just wait. Outside, the cold came on without apology. The cold came the way serious things often do, not with warning enough to prepare, but with enough to make a person understand, afterward, that the signs had been there all along. The creek went first. One morning it simply was not moving. Where there had been the sound of water threading over stones, there was silence, and that silence had a particular quality to it, a held-breath stillness that belonged to the deep of January, not the middle of November. He stood at the bank and looked down at the gray surface and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite fear, but was its quieter neighbor. Within a week, the hills to the north had gone the color of iron filings, gray and featureless, under a sky that offered no softness. The sun appeared each day at a low angle, pale and remote as a lamp behind frosted glass, and by mid-afternoon it was already letting go of the valley, pulling its thin warmth back over the ridgeline and leaving the ground to whatever the night intended. The nights intended a great deal. He walked the fence line one afternoon and found the posts ringing hollow when he struck them. The ground had frozen hard already, 2 feet down or more, and the sound of it traveled up through his boot heels with a kind of finality. Across the northern field he could see the Granger place, smoke going from 2 chimneys at once, and he wondered how the cattle were faring, how any of them were faring out on this valley floor that had decided, without much deliberation, to become something else entirely. Word came in pieces, the way valley news always did. A neighbor, 2 miles east, had lost his cold-stored turnips to freeze in a single night. The root cellar had not been enough. Another family had gone into their apple barrels and found the fruit already browning at the cores, the rot moving fast in the freeze-thaw cycle that had set in before anyone thought to guard against it. A barrel of brine-packed beans had heaved and cracked. A smokehouse had been found drafty in a place no one expected. The valley was beginning to understand the scale of what it was holding. She stood at the window one evening with her hands wrapped around a cup of something warm and looked out at the dark yard where the rows of buried clay pots lay invisible under snow and hardened earth. She could not see them. She could not see any sign of them at all, and in that invisibility there was either a failure or a kind of safety. She did not yet know which. The earth had closed over them completely, and what that earth was doing, whether it was keeping faith as her grandmother had written, or simply swallowing the whole season whole, remained its own sealed secret. Outside, the cold pressed against the glass. The valley waited inside it, every homestead quiet and counting, none of them yet knowing what February would ask of them. Word by word, the valley began to speak. It spoke first through small things. A comment passed at the mill, a question left half-finished at the dry goods counter, the way a man's eyes dropped when he described what he'd found in his cellar that morning. By the time January hardened into its most remorseless weeks, the small things had gathered into something larger, and the shape of that larger thing was loss. The Grangers were the first whose situation became widely known. Their cellar was a substantial one, dug deep beneath the north side of their main barn, which in most years was the better position for it, insulated by the structure above and banked by the slope behind. But the freeze-thaw cycle that had rolled in after the first hard cold had done something particular to that cellar. Warm days pressed down through the barn floor. Cold nights dropped the temperature back again, and the barrels of apples inside had been cycled through the change so many times that when the cellar was opened, the fruit inside had turned soft and dark, the flesh gone mealy and pale, whole barrels reduced to something between cider and rot before December had even closed. It was not a small loss. The Grangers ran cattle and had other provisions, but the fruit was gone, and the men who worked that operation knew what it meant for the long months still ahead. Widow Foss's situation was quieter, but no less complete. She had wrapped her apples individually in cloth and packed them carefully in straw inside a shallow wooden box she kept in her lean-to storage. The method had served her in easier winters, but this winter was not an easier winter, and when she finally opened the box, she found the apples, transformed by the cold, into something entirely different from what she had stored. Hard as green wood, mealy at the first bite, the frost, having drawn the sweetness out, and left only fiber and water behind. She did not tell many people, but the valley had a way of knowing things, and it knew. On a gray afternoon near the last week of January, the husband walked out to the trench site behind the root cellar. He brought no tool with him, just his boots and his coat, and the particular attention of a man who has wagered a season on something he cannot see. He pressed the toe of his boot against the earth above the first row of pots. The ground did not give. It was hard, yes, cold compacted and firm, but it was even. No heaving, no surface cracking of the kind that came when freeze-thaw worked its way too deep. The temperature differential he had packed into the trench, the extra foot of straw insulation, the clay lid sealed with beeswax, the 2 feet of soil above, seemed to have held the cold steady rather than cycling it. The earth there had not shifted, it had kept. He stood over it a long moment. Then he walked back to the cabin, and something in him that had been drawn tight since October released, just slightly, into the cold afternoon air. The crack came in the night. She heard it before she understood it, a low, decisive sound beneath the wind, like a seam giving way under too much pressure. She lay still in the dark for a moment, listening, and then she knew. The root cellar. She rose without waking him, pulled her coat over her shoulders, and stepped outside into a cold, so absolute it seemed to have weight and texture, like pressing through something solid. The cellar door was already forced slightly open by the shift in the earth beside it. She pulled it wide and descended, and the temperature inside hit her like a wall. Not the cool, steady chill that good cellaring required, but something rawer, exposed. A crack ran the length of the north wall, roughly the width of 2 fingers at its widest point, following the line of a frost seam she had noticed forming back in November and had packed with rags and hoped would hold. It had not held. By morning, they understood the full measure of it. The jars of pickled beets, 14 of them, had frozen and burst. The dried corn, hanging in its cloth bags along the north shelf, had absorbed the damp cold and gone brittle, and then soft in the overnight cycling, and when she lifted the first bag it came apart in her hands, the kernels dark and wrong. She set it down carefully, the way you set down something you cannot afford to throw and cannot bear to keep. He stood at the cellar entrance a long time without speaking. There was nothing in the silence that required words. The winter had reached inside their careful work and taken what it wanted. They spent the day accounting for what remained. The losses were real, and the hunger that would follow was real. They would need to stretch their grain stores and watch the weeks carefully from here to spring. It was not disaster in the way that disaster came to some. They were not broken. But it was the kind of setback that required the body to work harder than the mind wanted to. And it required something like grief before it required anything like planning. That evening, he went out behind the root cellar. The trench was as he had left it. The ground above the pots had not shifted. The extra foot of straw insulation, the beeswax-sealed lids, the full 2 feet of soil bearing down. The system had kept its own temperature, steady and separate from everything above it. Where the cellar wall had cracked open to the sky, the earth had simply stayed earth. She came out and stood beside him in the dusk, her arms crossed, her breath a small column of white in the still air. He said nothing. She said nothing. There was an understanding between them that did not need to be spoken. The thing they had buried in October, the thing the valley had laughed at, was still down there. Waiting, whole, untouched by everything the winter had done. The coldest weeks came without announcement. There was no storm to mark their arrival, no wind to declare the shift, only a gradual deepening, as if the valley were drawing a long breath inward and holding it. The creek slowed to a murmur beneath its shell of ice, then went silent altogether. The cottonwoods along the bank stood like chalk marks against a sky the color of pewter, and the snow that had fallen in early January packed and hardened into something more like stone than weather. He spent the first days after the cellar crack working methodically, without haste and without complaint. He mixed a rough mortar from clay and straw and filled the fracture as best he could, tamping the seams with his knuckles until his hands ached from the cold. It would not be a perfect repair. The wall had heaved, and heaved walls remembered their breaking, but it would hold against the wind, and that was enough for now. He banked the outer face with packed snow, which was its own kind of insulation, and drove stakes to keep it in place. Inside, she worked by lamplight through the inventory. The pickled beets were gone, the jars having frozen and pushed their lids crooked, letting in air that finished what the cold had started. The dried corn had survived only partially. 2 of the 5 sacks were sound, the others damp and beginning to smell of something she did not want to name. She restacked what could be saved, hung the corn sacks from the ceiling beam where the temperature held most steady, and wrote figures in pencil on the back of an envelope. They had enough. Not abundantly enough, but enough if they were careful and did not waste a meal. That was the word for February in the High Valley. Careful. He ate what she set before him and said it tasted fine. She ate less than she served him and said she was not hungry, which was not quite true, but was the kind of not quite true that kept a household from falling into despair. In the evenings they sat close to the iron stove, which they fed sparingly, and she mended, and he carved a new handle for the root cellar door, and neither of them spoke much about what lay behind the cellar in its trenched and frozen dark. But both of them thought about it. The pots had become something like a promise that neither dared examine too closely, not yet. The ground was sealed, the beeswax held. Beneath 2 feet of iron-hard soil, something patient was waiting out, the worst of the world above it. He had walked out twice in the deep quiet of the night, and stood over the trench for a long moment, before turning back toward the warm doorway. February was not finished with them, but it was not forever either. The morning they chose came in on a held breath. The sky had gone pale before sunrise, the color of old pewter, and the cold was the particular kind that sat in the lungs and made each breath feel borrowed. She had set the coffee on before he was fully dressed, and neither of them spoke at the table. There was nothing to say that had not been said already in the long silence of the weeks before. He finished his cup, she finished hers. He stood, and she stood, and they put on their coats. They carried the short iron bar and the wooden mallet out to the trench together. The ground above the pots had stayed sealed and undisturbed through everything the winter had thrown at it. Every wind that scored the valley floor, every freeze that had driven into the root cellar wall and opened it like a fault line. Out here, 2 feet down, the earth had simply held. He worked the iron bar along the edge of the compacted soil, breaking the crust in careful increments while she held the lantern low. The cold came off the disturbed ground in a clean wave that smelled of clay, and somewhere beneath it, something older, dark soil, dry straw, the mineral patience of deep earth. It took longer than he expected to reach the first pot. His hands were stiff inside his gloves. She set the lantern down and crouched beside him, and neither of them spoke. When his knuckles found the clay curve of the lid, he stopped. He looked at her. She was already watching him, her breath a small, steady cloud between them, her eyes quiet and unreadable in the lantern light. She had believed in this from the beginning, from the first letter, from the first shovel-load of clay. But belief was a different country from certainty, and they were standing at the border now. He worked the mallet gently against the seal. The beeswax and clay rim cracked at its seam, clean as a line drawn in frost, and he lifted the lid away. The smell reached them before the sight did. It rose from the open mouth of the pot like something that had no business existing in February. Sweet, alive, faintly floral, the unmistakable breath of autumn still folded and intact inside that dark vessel. He reached in without thinking and closed his hand around the first apple. It came out firm, cold smooth, flushed at the cheek with the deep red it had worn on the branch in September, as though the season had simply been waiting inside, unhurried, preserved the way a coal holds heat inside a gray exterior. She took it from his hand. She turned it slowly in her fingers. The valley was silent in every direction, the sky enormous and still above them. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Word travels the way cold does on open ground, not announced, just suddenly present everywhere at once. By the following morning, someone had told someone, and by afternoon the telling had moved past the Foss place and reached the mill road. She had not gone looking for attention. He had not ridden out to invite anyone. They had simply opened one pot, stood in the silence of what they found, and carried a dozen apples inside to set on the table, like a thing that needed no explanation. But the valley had its own ways of knowing. The first to come were the Halbert cousins from the South Ridge, cautious, standing at the fence line with their hats in their hands before he waved them through. They traded a small sack of dried beans for 6 apples and left holding them the way a person holds something they expect to dissolve. Word from them reached the Dunmore place by nightfall. After that, the visitors came with more purpose. Flour arrived in cloth sacks, salt in paper parcels twisted at the corners, a small amount of coin, offered quietly, and accepted the same way. She kept a running tally in the small ledger she used for seed counts, her handwriting steady and careful, column by column. He carried the pots up from the trench one at a time, brushing the soil from each lid before he brought it to the table, treating each one with the same unhurried attention he had given the first. The Grangers came on the 4th day. They came with a wagon, and fewer words than anyone. The older Granger said nothing about the mud rows he had laughed over in October. He looked at the apples, looked at the trench, looked at the sky, and then he looked at the ground for a long moment, before naming a fair price and paying it without argument. There was a respect in the silence that would have been impossible in words, and she accepted it the same way, without requiring more. Widow Foss came last and longest. She brought a jar of pale honey, sealed with a cloth top, and stood in the doorway long enough to ask, plainly and without embarrassment, how it had been done. She did not ask to mock or to diminish. She asked the way a practical woman asks about something she means to try. So she was told, the straw wrapping, the clay, the beeswax seal, the depth of the trench, the insulation of the banked earth above it. She listened without interrupting, nodded slowly when it was finished, and said she had heard of such a thing once but never believed it could hold through a winter like this one. The valley had not thawed. The cold was still absolute, and the sky still the color of pewter above the ridgeline. But something had shifted in the way people moved through it. A loosening, small but real. The way a room feels when someone finally opens a window. The payment was made on a Thursday, in the land office at the edge of the small town, where the valley's business settled itself each winter. He set the folded money on the counter without ceremony, and the clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers who had seen 100 such transactions, counted it twice, stamped the document, and slid the paper across, with no more fanfare than a man passing salt at a table. But the paper was theirs, and when they stepped outside into the hard February light, she held it with both hands, as though feeling the weight of the land itself, pressed into the thin folded sheet. The seed was purchased the same afternoon. Rye for the field, oats for the lean season, and a small packet of kitchen garden seed, onion, turnip, parsnip, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Practical things, the things that would feed what came next. They drove home along the creek road with the paper folded inside her coat and the seed bags tucked beneath the wagon seat, and neither of them spoke much. The valley spread around them the way it always had, immense and indifferent and beautiful. But it looked different now, not smaller, not tamed, only more clearly theirs, the way a thing looks when you have truly earned the right to call it so. That evening, when the light was going amber and long across the snow, they walked the ground behind the orchard together. The 40 trees stood bare and patient in their winter shapes, each branch a dark line against the sky. He carried 2 sharpened stakes and a length of cord. She carried the rough sketch she had drawn on a piece of brown paper at the kitchen table. The new rows extending south and east, doubling what was already there. They moved slowly through the cold, measuring the distance between the old trees and the new ground, pressing stakes into the frozen earth at intervals to mark where each young tree would go. The work was quiet and deliberate. The valley caught the last of the sun in long gold strips along the ridgeline above them, and the creek made its small, steady sound somewhere below. When the stakes were placed, they stood together at the edge of the marked ground and looked out over what they had done and what they meant to do. The land had kept their secret through the worst winter the valley had seen in a generation. Now, it would hold something better, roots and blossoms and years of patient return. She folded the sketch and pressed it into her coat pocket. He picked up the cord and the remaining stake. There was nothing that needed saying. There rarely was, between 2 people who had chosen the same life with the same seriousness and meant to keep choosing it, as far as the ground stretched before them.